We've been in this message series entitled Follow Me for the last few weeks, and what we're trying to figure out is what does it mean to be the church? You know, as a congregation, Quest Fellowship Church is about 100 years old. We look good for our age, I know. Back in the day, Quest Fellowship started as Johnson Memorial Baptist Church in 1914. Then it became North Street Baptist Church in 1941. Then I became pastor in 2003, and things began to change. It was a church that was struggling, that only had about 50 people or so on a Sunday morning, elderly congregation that was really struggling to try to find a way to connect with a culture that had shifted dramatically around it. And so we began to talk about shifting some things around and doing some things differently. One of the things we identified was an opportunity that we had with the property that we had in downtown Raleigh was to sell that property and to relocate. And so that was a challenging process to go through, but we decided to do that and identified some opportunities to places that we could move to relocate to. We sold that property for a little over $2 million. It was a building that was breaking down around us. Literally, the foundation was literally crumbling. The roof was leaking. The heat and air didn't have time work. I had to go early on Sunday mornings to kind of go down and kick the furnace to kind of get it going. It was one of those deals. And we didn't have any money to do anything about any of that. And so relocating made sense for us in a lot of ways. Plus, it gave us an opportunity to kind of revision kind of who we were as a church, to kind of look at how we were doing church as well. Not just let's take the church and let's move it to a different facility. Let's negotiate how it is that we're doing church. What is the ecclesia? What is the way in which we're doing church? So we began to negotiate some of that, and I began to present to them my ideas and my beliefs and my vision for what is now Quest Fellowship Church. And so we went through the process, a very difficult, long process. And you can imagine that if you take a church congregation that's been in this facility, this one facility, its whole existence, over 90 years in this one place, and the people that are there, some of them had been in that church for over 60 years themselves, and you ask them to let's relocate and let's do something different. That was not a fun process and not something that some of them really engaged in very easily. And so we began to talk about what we were going to look like when we relocated, and we talked about structures and facilities and all these different kinds of things and all the different questions and the concerns that people had. A lot of times I would just struggle a lot. I'd come home so frustrated because people, I felt like, were worried about things that didn't really relate to the kingdom of God. And so one of the things that I did to kind of help them see some of what I was seeing was we were downstairs in the old fellowship hall in the old building one night and talking about what kind of church we would become. And I wrote on the whiteboard 2 circles. One circle, and I labeled it kingdom stuff. And I wrote another circle, and I labeled it other stuff. And so we began to talk about all the things that they were concerned about. What are we going to do about the pews? So I began to ask them the question, is that something related to the kingdom? Or is that something that's just other stuff? Well, what about the stained glass windows? What about the plaques? What about the lights? What about all the stuff, all the furniture? What about all the things that, the hymn books and the organs and the choir and all that? What about all that stuff? And so we began to negotiate and talk about, okay, and I kind of began to help them see that all these things are simply tools. They're other stuff to help us accomplish kingdom stuff. And I had so many questions about what we were going to do with the plaques and all the things that were vestiges of church of olden times. That those things were obstacles to keep us from really engaging in unchurched culture. They didn't care about any of that stuff. And so I really began to challenge them to really think about, okay, are you going to ask me some kingdom questions? In other words, how are we going to reach the lost? How are we going to help people grow in their faith? How are we going to engage a culture that's moving further and further and further away from the gospel of Jesus Christ? How are we going to bring the gospel to them? How are we going to present the gospel in such a way that impacts their lives? You start asking me those questions, those are kingdom questions. But if you're worried about the plaques, that's not a kingdom question. And that was an eye-opening experience for some of the people in the room. And so I think when we come to this point today, in Matthew chapter 16, we're having one of those same kind of moments that Jesus takes with his disciples. He has just had the conversation with them where he talks to them about him establishing his ecclesia, him establishing his church. And he says, I'm gonna build it on this foundation, this revelation that Peter has identified, that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. And on this foundation, on this truth, I'm going to build my church. That moment has occurred, okay? And this is what I call a turning point moment. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's move forward in the story from, we just had that conversation, all right? This is what's going to happen. I'm going to build my church on this. And now he transitions into this next interaction that we read in Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Jesus has said, I'm going to build my church on the truth, on the foundation that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. And now he's saying, these are the things that must happen in accordance to that truth. All right, so let's look. Whenever you see a phrase like this, from that time, in Scripture, that should heighten your alert sensors, right? Bells should start going off in your brain. You should start asking the questions, what is that time referring to? Because sometimes you can read this passage outside of this context. Somebody may hand you a piece of paper with just this passage on it, and you read, from that time, Jesus began to tell them, and you want to know, okay, well, what was that time? What was that time referring to? These are those moments in time where you look at Scripture and you say, okay, I need to identify what that is, what's taking place. And what is taking place is that Jesus has just had this conversation about how he's going to establish his church. And so that conversation was what we call a fulcrum moment to me. I mean, this is what I call a fulcrum moment. A fulcrum, basically, for those of you who don't understand what a fulcrum is, I don't mean to bore you with physics and other things this morning and mechanical engineering, but basically a fulcrum is is a pivot point where stuff happens. In other words, if you don't have a fulcrum, it's going to be hard to move a heavy load. Imagine, if you will, somebody has a big boulder and they're trying to move the big boulder. In order to move the big boulder that they can't move on their own, they incorporate what we call a fulcrum. And so they might get a long, heavy rod, and then they'll take a smaller rock, and they'll put it next to the big boulder. And then they'll take the heavy rod and they'll wedge it underneath the boulder and push down on the small rock, and it gives them a fulcrum, or an ability to move the bigger rock. So a fulcrum is a powerful tool to help us move things that otherwise wouldn't get moved. It's a place where things are turning, where things are happening around. And so you've had fulcrum moments in your life. Maybe the day you got married was a fulcrum moment in your life. Some of you women in the room are like, yeah, what was I thinking, right? Some of your men in the room are thinking, how did I convince her to do that? Fulcrum moments, maybe when you had your first child, was a fulcrum moment. You're like, oh, this parenthood is great. It's just this beautiful moment, right? And then you have your second one. And you're like, what were we thinking? Right? Fulcrum moments, maybe it was a moment where you graduated and achieved a college degree or a master's degree, or maybe it's where you made a transition in your work. Maybe it's a fulcrum moment where you lost someone who's close to you. Maybe a divorce or a failure in life in some way. And those moments help to shape who you are as well. These fulcrum moments where things in your life turn. And maybe from that point forward, they will never be the same. Jesus has just given them a fulcrum moment when he says to them, I'm going to establish my church. Because I think in their mind, what they're thinking is, we're going to have Jesus forever, man. We're just going to hang out. We're going to watch him go around and feed people that we don't have food for. We're going to watch him heal people. It's just going to be great. We're going to be like the roadies for the rock star, man. People are going to think about us in great terms because we're associated with Jesus. We're his homies. We hang out with him. And so they were thinking, I think, that this was going to be a great ride, and they were going to ride it as long as they could. But Jesus says, no, that's not what's happening here. On this foundational truth that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God, I'm going to build my church. But in order for him to become the Christ, all these things that he's getting ready to describe have to happen. This is a fulcrum moment. It's also mission defining. In other words, this moment in what Jesus says about the church defines the mission of the church. It was an opportunity for them to understand and to kind of reflect back to this moment after his death and his resurrection, to kind of look back through the filter of all that they've experienced with the resurrected Christ, to look back and to see this moment in time, this interaction that they had with Jesus when he says, I'm going to build my church, as a mission-defining moment. In other words, it was the first time that Jesus had really uttered to them, I'm going to build a church. It was the first time that the followers of Jesus ever thought about the concept of a church, of an ecclesia, gathered around this truth that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So we stand here today as an extension of that movement, as an extension of that mission that Jesus defined in that moment when he's talking to them. This conversation that he's having also, that he had, also lays the foundation for his trip to Jerusalem. That would be the culmination of his ministry. In other words, if he doesn't have this conversation about establishing the ecclesia, about establishing the church before he goes into Jerusalem, then they don't have anything, any point to go back to say, oh yeah, that's what that was about. But now they have a defining moment that they can go back to and say, oh, I get it now. It makes sense. All the pieces are falling into place. So, we've talked about that time, looking back. What about looking forward? What's next? What's around the bend? What's coming? Jesus says, I must go to Jerusalem too. And then he goes through this list of things. Not fun things. Let's break that down a little bit this morning. First of all, he says, I got to go to Jerusalem. So what's so important about Jerusalem? Jerusalem was the center of power and authority for the Jewish world, the Jewish community. It was the place that housed the temple. It was the place where sacrifices were given. It was the city of David. It kind of tied Jesus to the Davidic covenant, back to the promise that God made to David that one of his descendants would sit on the throne of Israel forever. And so Jesus is going into Jerusalem, and he's going to walk in and ride in on a donkey as a king rides into a place that he's conquering. And Jesus is establishing his claim on the throne of David. So Jerusalem is the place that it has to happen. In Jerusalem are the people that have the power to have him crucified. In Jerusalem is the place where the temple resides. It's where the priest every year made a sacrifice to cover the sins of the people for that year. The high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, the place that only he could go, and only he could go once a year. And every time he would go in, they would tie a rope around him in case he accidentally touched the Ark of the Covenant and died, so they could drag him out. And so the priest would go into the Holy of Holies, and he would make a sacrifice each year for the sins of the people, to atone for their sins. And Jesus is going into Jerusalem, to this place, to abolish that system, to fulfill that system and make it complete. When Jesus dies on the cross, that temple is ripped from top to the bottom. Humanity no longer needs a priest to go in and to make atonement for us, for our sins, because Jesus has completed it once and for all on the cross. And so now we have access ourselves to the Holy of Holies. We talked about the Holy Spirit coming. You know, that was an opportunity that Jesus gave to us. He just says, when I'm gone, the Helper's going to come. And it's that ripping that makes that process available to us, that we can come and have access to the very presence of God. So he had to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a central part. It's a significant part of the process, the city itself. He says, I'm going to suffer many things. Look at the list of things that Jesus is going to suffer when he goes to Jerusalem. First of all, there's the betrayal of one of his closest confidants. One of the people that says, I'm following you, Jesus. I'm with you, Jesus. I believe in you, Jesus. This man, Judas, betrayed him and gave him up. And then he was arrested in Jerusalem. He was interrogated by the chief priest, interrogated by the ruling authorities, the Roman rule. Then he was beaten and he was flogged. He was humiliated throughout this whole process. You can imagine the humiliation. The Roman guards making fun of him, placing the crown of thorns on his head and mocking him. Even when he's placed on the cross, Pilate puts over a sign over his head and says, "The King of the Jews." And the chief priest said, "No, he's not the King of the Jews." Put up there that he said he was the King of the Jews. He was humiliated in that whole process. Imagine having to stand there in front of the people that you're dying for and hearing them yell, "Crucify him, crucify him," knowing that you're dying for every one of their sins. Not to mention the crucifixion itself. What a brutal thing to go through. Being nailed to a cross. The brutality of being left there, alternating, putting your weight on your arms and weight on your legs to try to extend yourself as long as you can. Everything cramping and everything in pain. In essence, what happens to somebody on the cross is eventually they just suffocate because the pressure on their torso is so great and they can no longer support themselves. This is what Jesus was going to suffer. And ultimately, I think his greatest suffering was that moment on the cross where he's carrying the weight of all of our sin. And he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I think in that moment, because of the weight of our sin, he's separated from the presence of the Father. For the first time for all of eternity. Imagine the suffering there. Jesus says, "I'm going into Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer many things at the hands of the scribes, the elders, the scribes, and the chief priest." These are the people who are like the religious leaders of the day, man. But Jesus identified the people who were going to have him crucified, the people that were going to be battling against him. These are the people that had the authority and had the power to have him executed. And these are also the people that are supposed to be portraying to the people and teaching the people about what it meant to follow God. And yet they're going to have an innocent man crucified simply as a result of their fear. A fear that their power and their authority within the Jewish faith is going to be eroded. So they had made their faith about themselves. I'm glad we never do that. The voice of fear for them was greater than the heart of God. He was going to be killed, he said. It wasn't that I'm going into Jerusalem and I'm going to die of natural causes. I'm going to get pneumonia, I'm going to get the flu, whatever, I'm going to get Ebola, whatever, and I'm going to just die. No, he said I'm going to be killed. People are intentionally out to end my life. This is an ultimate sacrifice that Jesus was going to endure for us. He says, then I'm going to be raised on the third day. Now, obviously, when Peter's hearing this list of things that are going to happen, and maybe the other apostles too, Peter's just the one who speaks up, but maybe just kind of gloss over this point here that he's going to be raised on the third day. Or maybe they didn't believe it. I don't know. I'm not sure what was going on there. Maybe they were just so horrified by all the other stuff that Peter just couldn't get beyond that and said, no, I don't want you to go through, even if you are going to be raised on the third day, I don't want you to have to go through all of this. But the resurrection, going to be raised on the third day, this is the promise of life beyond death for humanity. This is the hope of humanity. This gives us an eternal thing to look toward as followers of Jesus. And it also has an infusing effect to empower the movement of the church that Jesus has just said, I'm going to begin. I'm going to build my church on this truth that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. And if he didn't sacrifice himself on the cross, if he didn't raise himself on the third day or be raised on the third day, then all that goes away. The power of the movement of the church just goes away. In other words, that Jesus was not resurrected and had not encountered his apostles after his resurrection, then they would have just dwindled and just kind of filtered back into humanity, and nobody ever would have even taken notice of them anymore. They had already started doing that. They were hiding away, fearful for their lives. And they encountered Jesus in his resurrected form, and boom, Peter's out preaching in front of 3,000 people, 3,000 Jews, the same people who had said, crucify him, crucify him. Peter's standing before them, preaching the gospel to them. Whereas just before that, he's hiding away, afraid for his life and denying that he even knows Jesus. Something happened to transform their actions from being fearful to being bold. And that thing was that they encountered Jesus in his resurrected form. They encountered a living, breathing Jesus. And that's what gave the church its power. And that is ultimately what defeated the enemy. This is all going to happen in Jerusalem. This is what Jesus says is going to happen. And so he's telling them this ahead of time. Prepare yourselves, people. I've just talked to you about the church. Don't forget that conversation, because we're getting ready to go through all this stuff. And it's significant because it builds into this. And Peter says, no, we can't do that. Peter pulls Jesus aside and rebukes Jesus. Dude was bold, man, I'm going to tell you. Hey, dads in the room, and some of you guys I know, like big, strong, strapping dudes. Has your son ever pulled you aside and said, wait a minute, Dad, you can't do that? My son can do it now because he's 6'5", but it's been a long time coming. In other words, there's certain things you just don't do. Students, you ever go up to the principal at school and pull them aside, man, you can't make announcements like that, man. It's really, you can't do that anymore. Don't be doing that. Don't be doing that. You ever try to pull a police officer over? You didn't stop. You didn't make a stop back there at that red light. You just kind of right on through it. There's certain things you just don't do. And yet Peter goes up to Jesus, the rabbi, the king, the one he's just said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he pulls him aside. No, you can't. No, that can't happen, Jesus. We're not going to let that happen. So Jesus looks at him and he says, get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me. You're focused on the things of man instead of the things of God. And every time I read this passage, I lean towards quickly and initially thinking, Peter, you fool. And then I remember myself. And I remember how much of my life, how much of my energy I spend focusing on the things of man instead of the things of God. And how much oftentimes I'm a hindrance to the gospel. Just my sin and my flesh get in the way. And then I have to pray in repentance to God and say, God, forgive me for thinking Peter's worse than me, when in reality I'm much worse than he ever was. So let's look at this a little bit. This interaction is so fascinating to me and so challenging. He says, get behind me, Satan, number one. So why would he say this to Peter? Why didn't he say, get behind me, Peter? Why didn't he say, get behind me, Peter? Why didn't he say, hey, Simon Barjona, which is another thing he calls him, Simon, son of John. Why don't you get behind me, man? Why don't you just step back into your place and let me do my thing? But he says, get behind me, Satan. Now, I take that there's some significance in him identifying him as Satan in this moment. Obviously, he's not looking at Peter and identifying that Peter is Satan. But what he's identifying is that if Peter is willing to try to stand in the way of what must happen according to the plan of God, then you are aligning yourself with Satan. There's two teams. There's only two. There's only two. We got a Super Bowl coming up. You got the Patriots and the Seahawks. All the other teams are done, man. If you're going to watch the game and pull for somebody, you got to pick one team or the other. You can pick the evil empire in Patriot land that cheat and do all kinds of stupid stuff. Or you can choose the team of Russell Wilson. I mean, Even if y'all want to say that Russell Wilson didn't really finish at State, he played at State 3 years, okay? Plus, they got Hauschka, kicker from NC State. Don't forget that. All right, so you can pull for whoever you want to. I'm just saying, but there's only two teams, right? There's only two teams, one or the other. Two jerseys, two different colored jerseys. That's it. And so what Jesus is identifying in this moment to Peter is that, look, if you're going to stand in my way of what must happen in order for me to accomplish my mission and for the establishment of the church to take place, then you're aligning yourself with Satan. Because Satan is against what I'm about to do. Satan is against everything that's about to happen. Because ultimately that's his defeat. That's why he says, get behind me, Satan. And then he says, you're an hindrance to me. You're an hindrance to me. A hindrance basically is where you kind of get in the way of making things happen. You know, I like to build stuff at my house, and been working on an entertainment center over the last couple of days for our bonus room. And oftentimes my wife will ask me, hey, can I help you? I'm like, not really. But simply because of the way I work. Not that she wouldn't be good help, but she's great help. And I'll try to find something for her to do, you know, help me carry stuff or whatever. But the reality is that because of the way my brain works, because I'm such an introvert and I have everything planned out up here, that it's hard for me to articulate it sometimes, you know, and I don't really want to take the time to. So it's really just more of a hindrance for me to have help than it is for me to actually just do it myself. When I used to do interior trim work for my living, that's what I did for years. You know, I was an interior trim carpenter, did all kinds of stuff, built cabinets, and I built in bookcases and decks and all kinds of stuff and did interior trim. And I loved working by myself. I loved it. And when I actually began to expand my business and I began to hire people, I hated it. Because I didn't have control anymore over the work and the quality of work, and things began to kind of slip. So I had to make decisions about, okay, well, I'll just only take on enough work that I can do. And that way I can control the quality. Because anything else is a hindrance to what I'm trying to accomplish. Some of you have those people at work that every time you do something, they want to kind of undo it. And they become a hindrance to you and to what you're trying to accomplish. Jesus is saying to Peter, if you're not with me, you're a hindrance to me. Did you hear that? He said, if you're not really willing to follow me, no matter what the cost, no matter how difficult it be. I know I have not painted a pretty picture for you, Peter. I know it doesn't sound like it's going to be fun when we go to Jerusalem. But this is what's got to happen. And if you're not willing to stand with me, even when it's going to get difficult, even when it's not going to be pretty, then you're a hindrance to me. If you're not willing to really walk with me, no matter what the cost, it's not that you're just falling by the wayside. You're actually getting in the way of what I want to do. You're a hindrance to me. Don't try to change my mind or change the plan to fit what you want. This is what has to be accomplished. And if you're not willing to walk with me through that, then you're a hindrance to me. How many times do we find ourselves really trying to negotiate with God, trying to change the plan to fit what we want, and we become nothing but a hindrance to God? And then he says to him, you're setting your mind on the things of man instead of the things of God. Setting your mind when he says it like this, it gives me kind of an understanding that we have a choice to what we can set our minds to, right? You're choosing, in other words, to focus on the things of man instead of the things of God. So I'm asking you today, what are you choosing to focus on? You have an opportunity to choose to focus on the things of God or the things of man. So when you get up every day, you just pray, God, help me choose your way today. Help me see what you see today. Help me only pay attention to the things that you want me to do today. Give me a desire for you today. And help my flesh not to control me and not to overwhelm me. So let's look quickly at the things of man versus the things of God. Things of man basically cannot be identified with our personal agendas, our personal desires, the things that we want, the stuff of our life. In other words, whatever our flesh is drawn to, these are the things of man. Now, Peter sounds like he's being great. Like, Jesus, I don't want you to suffer. It's like it comes out of his love for Jesus. It's perfectly natural. It's perfectly understandable. But it also comes from his fear about what's going to happen if Jesus is gone. What's going to happen to me? That's underlying, certainly, but that's a part of the process. That's a part of his emotion. That's a part of what's driving him. So sometimes it's healthy for us to take a moment, to step back and to say, okay, why am I really feeling this? Where is this really coming from? What's at the core of what I'm dealing with? Is this really, am I making this about me? Because so often I find myself, and I know we find ourselves collectively trying to shape our faith in a way that fits us and fits our flesh instead of really truly identifying what does Jesus want from me. Let me do that no matter how hard or how difficult it may be. The things of God are all about love and sacrifice and peace and obedience. And these are not the things that our flesh is naturally drawn to. And so you see the inner battle that's taking place. And he's telling Peter, you're setting your mind on these things. Set your mind on the things of God. And the things of God have to be accomplished in order for humanity to have hope. That's what the church should be about. It should be a group of people collectively setting their mind on the things of God. Setting their mind collectively, individually, on the things of God and seeking that with a great passion and with a great energy. In other words, when you go throughout your week, what does it look like? Here's the two questions I want you to think about today as we go. Question number one is, am I shaping my faith in a way that reflects the desires of my flesh instead of the heart of God? Am I shaping my faith in a way that reflects the desires of my flesh instead of the heart of God? In other words, am I trying to put God where I want him instead of asking him where he wants me? Question number two. If I examine all of my conversations and social media posts from this past week, which category would they fall into? Things of God or things of man? Tommy and I toyed with actually handing you out a worksheet. Basically, it had 2 columns on it for you to go back and look at all your posts from the previous week and to write the post into the category that they fall into. To look at your Facebook and your Twitter and your Instagram, for those of you who do that, and to say, which category do they fall in? What am I really trying to accomplish with these posts? Because anymore today, that's really what defines us, some of you, is what does social media say about me? But for those of you who don't do that, think about your conversations that you've had, the interactions that you've had with people, the things that you've done this week, the tasks that you've laid out this week. Are you hurriedly and passionately going after the things of God, or are you hurriedly and passionately going after something else? Because this is how the church is defined. People who set their mind on the things of God and not the things of man, no matter how difficult it may be. I talked to you before about some of the transition process as we began this message today. For us as a church, it became very clear to me that God was leading me to lead this church on this journey. And I knew that it was going to be excruciatingly difficult. And there were many times in that process where I wanted to quit. And I begged God for another ministry, for something else to go do, because it was too hard. There was too much opposition. People were too adamant to not give up what they wanted instead of really pursuing what God was calling us to be. Are you willing to stay with it when the going gets tough, whenever God calls you to something and you know it deep down and you have a serious conviction about it? And even though the going gets tough, are you willing to stick with it and focus and set your mind intentionally on things of God and just be willing to take whatever comes? Because this is what Jesus did for you and for me. Are we willing to do it in honor of that sacrifice? Let's stand today. I'm going to pray for you and we're going to respond.